All right, welcoming next into the Flurry on the Hot Cage podcast. He's the editor for FightOpinion.com, the go-to site when you are making up your mind about all the issues in MMA. He can be followed on Twitter at FightOpinion. He's out there holding feet to fire and fighting the good fight, one of the few that is. He's Zach Arnold. Zach, how are you?
I'm good. What's going on?
Not too much. I wanted to talk to you about Fox Sports 1, but first I want to ask you a question. I kind of want to talk to you about your place on the MMA landscape for a second, because there are so few people in MMA media willing to sort of go after people. Do you perceive yourself that way? And if so, why do you do that?
I mean, the context I would say for the website is basically I started at Christmas of 2005, but I was writing about MMA before that, so I was writing a lot about Japan, and Japan was always my backbone. So the UFC wasn't my top priority, so I never really considered being political when it came to talking about the UFC. It wasn't something I considered my lifeline, so I never really considered it being a sycophant or kissing up to the UFC, because I didn't consider it my livelihood. Now others consider it their livelihood, and I understand that. And it doesn't mean I have to like it. I understand it. I know what exists, and you have to recognize it for what it is. And if you've read Devin this week, you've probably seen their article talking about the leaked emails regarding writers, what they can or cannot say, and a lot of it didn't surprise me.
Yeah, well, that's understandable. It's good that guys like you are out there, MMA on the reg, MMA supremacy. There's guys that I mean, it's needed. You guys are like sort of the TJ Quinns of the MMA world, and it's a necessary thing that needs to be done. So I'm glad you're out there. Okay, let's talk about this week in the scare amongst MMA fans that Fox Sports 1 would not be carried by major providers. So what is the very latest with who is carrying the channel and who is not?
Pretty much everyone's going to be carrying the channel. The question is whether or not some providers will carry it in standard definition, some will carry it in high definition. And the larger question is with Fuel TV, which is the home for a lot of UFC programming, whether or not that will get picked up by the cable providers. And if so, will that be in HD as well? It's a lot reminiscent of like MTV2 when Bellator was on there a few years ago, and they were all standard definition telecasts.
Okay, next I want to kind of get into how you've been kind of critical about UFC programming on Fuel and how little viewership it gets. Is that something you think that's likely to change with the rebranding?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not critical so much of UFC on Fuel. It's just the channel itself. The non-UFC programming, they get 1,000 viewers a show. I mean, they don't even hardly register for infomercial status, let alone a traditional sports network. So it's tough. I mean, UFC gave Fuel TV a lot of value, but the question is now with the rebranding to Fox Sports 2 and how many providers may carry it, may not carry it, who will carry it in HD. What does it mean for the UFC? It's very difficult. It's a very foggy picture right now.
That's true. I also read your piece about the UFC's demographics and how they relate to Fox Sports. It kind of talks about how there's a shift. Historically, we've always thought the 18 to 34 demographic was where all that had all this disposable income. And you were talking about how there's kind of a shift in the disposable dollar now. Some of the older folks have money, and that's why you see CBS kind of thriving right now. Can you kind of give a summary of what you wrote and how you think it affects the future of the Fox-UFC relationship?
Well, the idea always has been amongst TV executives that, hey, 18 to 34-year-olds, that's where you build your brands. That's why they're so valuable, and it's hard to get them because they have a short attention span. And therefore, the spin from Fox always has been, hey, look, UFC always gets 18 to 34-year-olds, always reliable, always consistent, and so it has a lot of value. But the problem is in today's economy, especially in the U.S. marketplace, where a lot of 18 to 34-year-olds have part-time jobs, are struggling to make ends meet, it's not so valuable when they don't have the disposable income to spend on pay-per-views, on advertising, in terms of buying products that are pitched to them. So the networks like CBS, the Tiffany Network, and NBC, the networks that have free telecasts, they're the ones that are going to benefit the most from the advertising revenue because they play to an older demographic which has money. And cash is king, and now, unless the economy improves in the next couple of years, UFC's value will be, I don't want to say overrated, but I will think it will be overplayed. So, I mean, it's always going to have some value, but I don't think it has the value that a lot of people think it does.
That's true. We may find ourselves in a scenario where, as UFC fans get older, if if the economy sort of stays the way it does, the UFC may have a resurgence as those people sort of come of age, and then they become no longer 18 to 34-year-olds, but the older, and you'd hope they would stick with the MMA programming. So we'll see. Okay, obviously we know the UFC can survive without Fox Sports 1, but how important do you think this weekend's fight, and on a larger scale, the UFC, is to the future of the Fox Sports 1 network itself?
Well, it's interesting because I don't put a lot of stock into the success of UFC's first show on Fox Sports 1 as a barometer of UFC on Fox. But if you look at a lot of traditional media outlets and you look at a lot of writers, there's this growing conventional wisdom, whether it's, I think it's misinformed, but there's a growing conventional wisdom that if the UFC does well, then that's a good barometer for Fox Sports 1. And if the UFC doesn't do well, then it's not a good barometer. And personally, I think that's the wrong metric to use. But it certainly applies a lot more pressure on UFC because the expectations are growing.
Yeah, they do. They do seem to be married to one another in a sense. I guess another question I got for you that I'm wondering is, I know it's a huge sort of fourth quarter for the UFC in terms of fights. I know Fox Sports 1's a big deal. You're saying that you think it's sort of overblown the importance of the launch of the network and the UFC's involvement in it. Do you think they're kind of underselling their 20th anniversary and it's going to just kind of go by with a sort of a whimper? And are they kind of underselling it because of some of the tentative relationships they have with some of their older stars?
I don't think hardly anyone realizes it's the 20th anniversary. It's incredible. You make a valid point there, which is there's so many shows and there's so many cards to promote that the idea of promoting the 20th anniversary just doesn't seem to be that kind of big landmark. If anything, the UFC 100 show proved to us that it was the 100th pay-per-view or the 100th numbered pay-per-view that was really the big deal. And I think we may see a lot more emphasis put on UFC 200 than we would ever see for a 20th anniversary of the promotion.
Yeah, I agree, and it's funny that you said that because I kind of want to transition into a little bit of Bellator talk here to get you out here on the end, because what I find interesting is they're sort of putting all their, eggs in one basket with this pay-per-view, and sort of there's not going to be, I tweeted out earlier, the cupboard's going to be bare for their 100 show. I kind of thought they should somewhat do the things together, make their 100 show their pay-per-view or something like that. I mean, I'm based out of Phoenix, so I'm a little selfish in the matter, but how do you think that well, first my question is, do you think Bellator's handling that properly? And secondly, with the UFC having this huge fourth quarter and Bellator kind of seeming like they're just going in all different directions, could this mean the end of Bellator?
I don't know if it'll ever be the true end of Bellator, but when you're controlled by a corporate entity like Viacom and they're not MMA promoters, they're MMA consumers. So they understand what it is on television, but they're not in the business for live gates. They're not in the business for anything else other than TV products. So I don't know if that was positions them well at all for producing live cards and doing sold shows and going to various venues. I mean, that's just not their deal. I mean, yeah, they'll leave it to Beyond Revenue to take care of it, but if Beyond Revenue was so successful on that front, then he wouldn't have sold Bellator to Viacom in the first place. So they're stuck. I mean, I understand the logic behind Rampage and Tito. I get it. It's probably the only thing they've done in the last year to generate any sort of mainstream buzz. But, man, is that short term.
Yeah, and business aside, I kind of want to tell you something I'm sort of trying to get some traction behind. I talked to Larry Pepe about it. I've talked to Adam Martin about it. I think that they should put Chandler Alvarez 2 as the main event and put Rampage and Tito as the co-main event, because I think it gets you the same set of eyes to that pay-per-view, and it sends a message, maybe not business-wise, but it sends a message to the guys that are currently fighters on Bellator's roster, that we take our fighters seriously. So what do you think about that?
Well, the problem is they may view Tito and Rampage as a more competitive fight than Alvarez and Chandler. I mean, Michael Chandler blitzed me the first time around, so they're probably very confident that he's going to do it again. I mean, I understand your point, which is, hey, you want Michael Chandler as the face of your deal, but he's not selling the pay-per-view. Rampage and Tito is selling the pay-per-view. That's the fight people want to see, and that's the risk you take when you book two veterans who aren't in your company, and you put them as the face of your company.
Well, there you have it, fans. He's the editor for FightOpinion.com. He can be followed at Fight Opinion. He's Zach Arnold. Zach, thank you very much for your time, and hope to talk to you soon.
All right, we'll talk soon.